Okay, so we're starting now. There were supposed to be 4 speakers, 2 of them canceled. So the Matteo Minden from the Usos and... recording. It is recording.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so Matteo Minden from the Usos and Thomas Faulkner from Die Linke canceled, which means we have basically the 2 speakers on the right, who are actual social democrats, are not here, which means we have basically the same panel as we had last year in London, of the CPGB and the IBP. So in introducing platypus panels, I guess it's customary to read the description. So it's customary to read the description and the question. So I'll try to do that quickly. So the description, which was not written by me, I'm not sure who wrote it, is electoral politics in the left, problems and prospects. During the 19th century, suffrage rights were widened in the heart of capital.
That was earlier.
I've already done it. I'll do it again if you want. Well, you see, it shows how unseriously. Yes, you can recycle the description. Okay, so socialism, democracy, and social democracy. The conditions for the novel political formations of Syriza and Podemos developed out of the disintegration of the traditional social democratic parties in Greece and Spain. Jeremy Corbyn, the new leader of the Labour Party in Britain, has argued for greater democracy in the party and invoked Labour's origins in working class organization and socialism. Yet it's unclear what is being remembered by this invocation and what is being forgotten. The Bernie Sanders campaign as a socialist candidate for the leadership of the U.S. Democratic Party appears equally obscure. Precisely when historical consciousness is most necessary, the project of social democracy seems to be fading from memory. Little remains of the foundation moment of social democracy today, both in practice and thought. In the late 19th century, working people's response to capital was expressed in the political demand for socialism. This demand galvanized the formation of European social democratic parties, guided by the ideology of Marxism. Among the most influential members of the German Social Democratic Party, the political leaders of the Second International agreed that the primary task of social democratic parties was bringing about the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, the decisive political struggle between capital and labor. And while some of these leftists ultimately found the revolution too risky in the decisive decades of the 1910s and 1920s, even their political judgment is far to the left of those Social Democratic Party members who, after World War II, openly espoused the integration of workers into a more just and thus more democratic capitalist order. Once a global movement for the self-emancipation of the working class, today's social democratic parties have fully substituted the task of educating workers in order to overthrow capitalism. With the task of creating and maintaining the conditions for a more just market economy, the present standpoint of social democracy is society is bound by national economies and mediated by the state. Social democracy today promises to fight social injustice in the name of the people, but it no longer promises to realize socialism. Yet what remains is the name, and with it the promise and problem of social democracy. In this panel, we would like to investigate this transformation by looking at the history of the birth and decline of social democracy. How can we understand the historical crisis of social democracy for the left today? How, if all, could the trajectory of social democracy shed light on problems yet to be superseded on the left today? And 4 questions were appended. 1, what was social democracy? How was it constituted? How did it form? And what was its ideological foundation? What problem did it address, and what promises did it make? 2, what role did social democracy play for the left throughout the 19th and 20th century? How has this role changed? How did it affect the world, and how was it affected by a changing world? When did it come into its own? 3, was the promise of social democracy fulfilled? If yes, how? If no, why did it fail? The current crisis of the left reveals a need for a reconsideration of socialist politics, yet social democratic parties are on the retreat and are unable to offer a credible alternative. What does this crisis tell us about the success, failure, and the need for social democracy? 4, what would you characterize as the beginning moment of the crisis of social democracy? Was it the revisionist dispute in 1903, the voting That's really the Bolshevik-Menshevik split. But sorry about that editorial comment. The voting of the war credits in 1914, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the New Left of the 1960s, the crisis of Fordism in the 1970s, the Reagan and Thatcher era of the 1980s, the creation of New Labour in 1994, the economic crisis of 2008. I think that, as implied in the title, the topic of this was to a large extent meant to be about social democracy, both seen from within and without, because we don't actually have the Social Democrats in the panel, and both panelists will be speaking from what they consider a revolutionary Marxist perspective. I think that the actual question of the topic also should focus on the first two terms about the meaning of socialism and democracy, as well as social democracy. Okay, who would like to go first? You want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So what party would I have been in 150 years ago? 100 years ago? Oh. What party would I have been 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago? Let's look at it with what we know today. Industrialization had changed society, poverty, lack of democracy. I believe that in 1869 I would have joined the Social Democratic Workers' Party. It had a clear commitment to the working class. The first social democratic program adopted in Eisenach had the goal of establishment of a free people state. There was also an outspoken commitment to the working class, but not to a struggle for class privileges. The abolition of all class rule was part of the program, and the replacing of the existing wage system with cooperative work. August Bebel attempted to get the demand for women's right to vote into the program. I would have been disappointed that couldn't get a majority, but at least the position against child labor was taken. 6 years later, 1875, at the Congress in Gotha, we had every reason to be glad about the fusion with the General German Workers' Association, although the Gotha program wasn't founded on Marxist theory. While there were statements on the free state and a socialist society about the abolition of the system of wage labor and the abolition of exploitation in every society and the elimination of all social and political inequality, there were lots of compromises without which a fusion with Lassalle's Workers' Association might not have happened. But still, we would have remained members of the Socialist Workers' Party, even though we would have shared Marx's criticism. Marx wrote in his letter to Wilhelm Bracke that he was in favor of every step of real movement. But if it was not possible to go beyond the Eisenach program, one should simply have concluded an agreement for action against the common enemy. By drawing up a program of principles, one sets up before the whole world landmarks to measure the level of movement. Marx would have preferred to postpone a common program until it had been prepared for by a considerable period of common activity. I wished some of the left groups today would remember that as a side remark. Instead, the program was in Marx's view a compromise, too much adapting to the more reformist positions of Lassalle's organization. 16 years later in Erfurt, the party decided on a new program. A year before, it had renamed itself to Social Democratic Party of Germany. Please note, add democratic and drop workers. In the name, I mean. However, there was some move back to Marxist theory. But in stark contrast to Marx, the program contained no explicit demands for a proletarian revolution. Reformist practice was underlined with clear targets, such as suffrage, 8-hour day, worker protection, and prohibition of employment of children under 14 years. The outbreak of World War I internationalized the political wings within the Second International. All sections had to decide how to answer the call to militarily defend their own countries. We know that the Social Democratic Reichstag faction voted in August 1914 for the war credits, thus granting funds to imperialist Germany for the imperialist war. Only Karl Liebknecht and one other member of parliament voted against it. Within the Second International, the majority chose the way of defense of the fatherland. 2 days earlier, the affiliated trade unions had already agreed to refrain from striking for the duration of the war. Leon Trotsky called August 1914 the effective death of the International. Instead of calling for the overthrow of their own capitalists and organizing strikes against the war, the British, the French, and the German sections sided with their respective capitalist class. Lenin and the Bolsheviks fought within the international social democracy under the slogan, "Change the imperialist war into a civil war." I see us standing historically with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. From now on, the Social Democratic Party was no longer our party. It had become a bourgeois workers' party. We distinguish between purely bourgeois parties and bourgeois workers' parties. Purely bourgeois parties, like the Democratic Party in the United States, may have workers among their members and voters. They may even get the support of the unions, but they are not independent structures of the labor movement. In Germany, the Greens are an example of a pseudo-progressive bourgeois party. In contrast, bourgeois workers' parties have been created by the workers' movement. They are organizationally independent of the capital, but they are bourgeois. They have a bourgeois program and a bourgeois leadership, and therefore they are not politically independent from the bourgeoisie. Marxists recognize that the continuing connection to the trade unions means that the social democratic parties remain bourgeois workers' parties. In certain circumstances, when such a party turns to the left and shows a willingness to fight for the rights of the poor and exploited, revolutionary could consider offering critical support. We could call for a vote to the Social Democrats, thus exploiting the contradictions between the illusions the workers have in them and hopes of its working class base and its pro-capitalist program. A revolutionary party might give critical support to a bourgeois workers' party to put it through a practical test, which the reformist can only fail. Lenin suggested this policy to the British communists in his left-wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. The English left communists, represented by Sylvia Pankhurst, had at that time refused to take part in parliamentary elections or to critically support the Labour Party, the British Labour Party. Labour was at that time a party that pretended to introduce socialism in England through parliamentary channels. The party was isolated from the British Liberals and Conservatives, which Lloyd George tried to unite against Labour. In this case, it was correct to critically support Labour. Under the inspiring influence of the October Revolution in Russia, in England much of the organized working class in the Labour Party had become receptive to the ideas of communism. But almost all of the proletariat at that time was organized in the Labour Party. The Communist Party, in comparison, had remained small. Pressured by proletarian dictatorship in Russia and by its own base, the leadership of the Labour Party was forced to show a left face. They pretended to take a class standpoint and competed in fact with the communists on elements of the Bolshevik program. It would have been our task to convince the proletarian base of the Labour Party that their leaders were only pretending to present their interests, that they were trying to win working class power with reformist means, and that this would be impossible. As long as the majority of the working class follows labor and not us, we will help labor to power in a bourgeois state. Through that test, we will be able to prove that labor's politics is all about. That's why we will give critical support. We applied this tactic in 2001 to the British elections, when we gave critical support to the small organizations of the British left, Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alternative, Scottish Socialist Party and Socialist Labour Party. Those parties ran independent candidates against Blair's New Labour Party in at least some electoral districts. We withdrew his support in later elections as these organizations moved to the right and posed less of an independent challenge. The revolutionary application of critical support, electoral support, differs significantly from the opportunistic one. While in principle Marxists are willing to call to vote for candidates of the labor movement who run on less than a revolutionary program, it is a prerequisite for any kind of electoral support that they present, at least on some issues, a serious challenge to capitalist interests. The lack of such challenge has made it impossible for us to give critical support to any of the two existing bourgeois workers' parties in Germany, the SPD and Die Linke. Marxists know that only the working class can overthrow capitalism, and by liberating itself, liberate the whole of humanity. Why is that so? The working class is the only class that has an objective interest in the overthrow of capitalism, and is in a strategic position to do so. To do this, we need a revolutionary party, that is a party that stands for the real interests of the working class, not for compromise. All wheels stand still. Now, the struggles of the working class are currently not aimed at overthrowing capitalism. We know that the reformist bureaucracy and trade unions and social democracy lead the working class. For more than 100 years, the reformist leaders existed mainly as agents of the bourgeoisie within the workers' movement, operating as some form of mediation between capital and labor. They give the workers nothing but compromises. After World War II, in Germany there was quite a sentiment for the nationalization of some major industries. Leading social democrats, some of which also trade union leaders, explained why they had been against it. We needed a negotiation partner in contract negotiation. Thus, they helped the capitalists go back into office. The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership. It is not enough to criticize the existing leadership, we must build a new one. Thanks.
By blind coincidence, I decided to start by talking about an occasion where Marx offered very enthusiastic support to a section of the bourgeoisie, which I suppose provides a nice counterpoint there. So we're talking about in 1864, the newly founded International Working Men's Association, or the first international, in November wrote at the urging and partially drafted by Marx, wrote a formal letter of congratulation to Abraham Lincoln on his election victory, and urged him on to. This was, of course, a time of the American Civil War. It was towards the end of the American Civil War. The North looked at this point quite likely to finish things off fairly soon, although it took another 6 or 8 months. And throughout the war, Marx had, and even in the run-up to it, Marx had played a greater role than is generally acknowledged in the course of events. His he had already, like as with many kind of revolutionary Democrats from his original milieu, they all looked at the United States as a certain sort of inspiration. Lincoln in a speech calls, our government is often referred to as an experiment in Republican government, and precisely this was of great interest to people who'd grown up in kind of Central European monarchies and had been cracking heads with the authorities there. But of course there was still this kind of, what Marx called a disfigurement, which was the persistence of slavery. The point about this is that in this particular issue, as for many other political issues on which Marx makes some substantial interventions, is that the two questions of what would have been called the social question at the time, i.e. kind of the economic condition of the toiling masses, and the political question, the question of democracy, were intricately linked. Because chattel slavery not only reduced black Americans to a state of absolute economic dejection and it's slavery, obviously, but of course by the same token completely politically disenfranchised them, and actually constructed very slightly bizarre pseudo wannabe feudal political regimes in the southern states. There was not universal suffrage in the United States at the time. There was in many of the United States, but I believe the property qualification for voting in South Carolina was a working estate and 10 Negroes, which should sort of tell you about the sort of people who are in charge there. These two questions were intimately intertwined. The Northern victory would not only unleash the full development of capitalism in American society and thereby the full proletarianization of the broad masses, but also enable a broad level of political liberation and therefore political organisation and ascending level. It would enable the conditions for the sort of now much larger working class to bind together quite closely. Marx had considerable influence over a lot of German emigres after the 1848 revolutions ended in failure. A lot of Germans washed up in America. It's sort of interesting if you compare them to the Irish, because on one level they're quite similar. They're both new waves of immigration. They're both predominantly Catholic. And in America, not only is it predominantly Protestant, but it is given occasionally to sort of virulent anti-Catholicism, sort of outbursts of that kind of bigotry. But with the kind of enthusiastic agitation of the old 48ers, the German working class in America was split sort of more or less down the middle on the question of the war, whereas the Irish were the absolute hardcore of support for the Peace Democrats, for pro-South elements, and of anti-black racism. So this was the kind of perspective that Marx was trying to put forward, and this is actually what is special about Marxism. Marxism is essentially there pre-existed Marxism the idea that capitalism should be replaced in some way by socialism, and the idea that workers should organise together to extend the suffrage. But the linking of the two, of the political revolution, as it were, to establish the fullest possible democracy, and the social revolution to overcome capitalism, and the idea that capitalism would inevitably retard democracy. And finally,
please close that to the microphone.
Sorry. And finally, that the working class, because it owned no property, because it had no social power except its sheer numbers, was the class to do it. That's the core of Marxism. The rest, as they say, is commentary. This is reflected in the birth of a formally Marxist movement in Europe with the Second International. The First International included several diverse sorts of forces, including anarchists, including the English trade unions, and even Italian left nationalists. The Second International began by excluding the anarchists. It was a much more closely ideologically defined, politically defined project. And it got its name essentially because under German conditions you were certainly not allowed to be a communist or even a socialist. That was very much against the ideas of what the Prussian state regime would want, so they needed a kind of code word name. This is actually fairly common in the history. Later on, I'll go back in a minute. So they chose social democracy, and Marx remarked that it's a pig of a name, but it'll have to do. But of course it did work, because precisely they were the people who linked the question of political liberation with the question of economic liberation. Having said all that, this holds more or less from 1914. 1914 is the crisis point. There are, of course, the revisionist controversies, but it's still the case that the congresses of the Second International down to 1914 all everyone knows a big war's coming. They all energetically oppose any coming war and threaten revolution if war breaks out. And in 1914, as we know, they don't make good on that promise, as it were. More crucially, in 1917, of course, the war leads to the collapse of the Russian Tsarist regime, and it is replaced ultimately after a year of struggle with the Bolsheviks, left SR, and Menshevik internationalist coalition government, which becomes the new force of the embryonic Soviet regime. And this is kind of the point of crisis for this identification with Marxian socialism, with democracy, which had previously just been its kind of defining feature. Even more true in Russia, given the level of Tsarist autocracy that existed there. The Russian regime is rapidly forced to militarize its operations in order to fight the civil war. It's extraordinarily difficult to fight a democratic war, if not impossible. It requires a level of social mobilization and command and control. You can't just keep that in the army, particularly if it's a very desperate war like the Russian Civil War was. Things started to tighten up very quickly. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is the peace agreement with the Germans, caused an irreversible split in the government. The left SRs walked out, and the Bolsheviks won the elections, because, in their view, the question was whether they emerged victorious, the regime emerged victorious, or they were all drowned in blood. And my view is that they were correct about that. They would have been drowned in blood. You can look at Finland, where 20% of the entire working class was murdered by Gustav Mannerheim for a taste of what was in store of Kolchak, and those lot had been victorious. You're talking about the murder of every leftist, liberal and Jew from Lviv to Vladivostok, and it would not have been pretty. Nonetheless, it was unable to present itself as a regime with the most incredible, fullest democracy, because it simply wasn't the case. The conditions they were operating under did not permit it. By the late 20s, of course, the Stalin faction had seized control, launched the first 5-year plan, and created a new, bizarre form of society that was characterized by the extreme tyranny and economic irrationality. And the Western Communist Party, the Communist parties elsewhere, were reduced to defending that. So they couldn't be the defenders of democracy either. On the other side, of course, we have the... right, yeah, Helen?
I was just wondering how much more time do you have?
I can wrap up in 7 minutes. 7 minutes and 13 seconds.
Okay.
I'll speed through it a bit, sorry. Or we could just argue about this for a little bit longer.
Well, if you want to, we can argue about it.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyway, the other side of it is, of course, that the all remains of social democracy becomes completely wedded to the bourgeois state, and it begins to identify, and it already had, the right wing of social democracy already had begun to identify the existing bourgeois political regimes as in some sense democratic much earlier. Those state regimes themselves, having been a bit ambiguous about it, put the democracy stuff front and centre after the Second World War to contrast American and European freedom with the Stalinist tyranny and Hitler's regime and so on. By the end of the Cold War, the Cold War ended with the victory of the West, and thus the victory of that idea that free market liberalism is democracy and socialism is horrible, horrendous tyranny. The trouble is that this simply isn't true. We can see that in the period since the end of the Cold War, democracy has not flourished and been extended, even in the ex-Stalinist regimes. Although there are elections, that these societies are characterised by the growth of incredible nationalism. In the West, political parties have become ossified, and we've had the rise of a kind of increasingly onerous sort of security apparatus in Britain and America particularly, which we've learned more and more about over recent years. There's also the question that capitalist society is inseparable from imperialism, which involves, on the one hand, still today propping up extraordinarily anti-democratic regimes in the Persian Gulf, for example, interfering with the affairs of countries, whatever their elected people think about it, and also enormously destructive wars that just spread chaos, out of which it is unlikely that anything other than, at best, an authoritarian strong-arm dictatorship will take hold. So the trouble with the social democracy is that we have lost the link in the collective mindset, but democracy cannot be fused to anything else. The capitalist mode of production will corrupt any political process that you put in place, will eventually draw the life out of it. Capitalism does not want democracy. It is stuck with some elements of it because we happen to be successful in former times. So I think I'll just leave it there, really.
Okay. So it's customary to allow the speakers to respond to each other at this point, but I sort of, because I know basic...
That's true.
But no, I also wanted to ask them questions, pose some questions to the speakers, because I have a sense of where they're coming from. So, first of all, I have a sense, basically from knowledge about the positions of the IBT and the CPGB, that the basis of the difference in your positions historically stems from the 9-year period from 1914 to 1923, mostly. And that sort of up to 1914, and I think the position of the IBT I find fairly, within a particular Trotskyist tradition, understandable. I'm a little less clear, and I think it would be helpful to explain the historical understanding of the CPGB. You seem on the one hand to be saying, we sort of support Lenin, but you, in some respects, also seem to side with Kautsky, but not with Kautsky in 1914. And you don't really seem to support either the founding of the Third or Fourth Internationals as a response to the crisis of social democracy going on from 1914. Would that be fair? I mean,
you want me to sort of come back now on that?
Yeah. Just sort of explain like what you see as the difference between, say, the CPGB's position and an Orthodox Trotskyist position here to start the conversation.
There's some difficulties in the sense that there is a particular Spartacist IBT variant of that narrative, in particular history, so maybe we can draw that out together. For us, the Lenin and Kautsky in 1914, it's perfectly. I find it difficult that it's difficult to understand because Lenin supported Kautsky until 1914, and he broke with him on the question of the war and Kautsky's prevarication on the war. He eventually came out as an anti-war person after a couple of months, and ended up in the Independent Social Democrats. His line was essentially pacifistic, and he was unwilling to permanently break with the right. He didn't understand that there was something far more important going on. But Lenin continues to cite Kautsky's writings until his death. It's just the material record is there. So that's not the issue. The Third International, well, yes, the Third International and Fourth International. The Third International is, straightforwardly, there is a question of principle on which there are two forces irreconcilably opposed, which is the war. And precisely, yes, the split was necessary. I don't see how it could possibly have been avoided without either the complete victory of the left, which was unlikely under the circumstances, or the capitulation to the right. So Fourth International is a different issue because it didn't represent anything socially weighted in the way that the Third International. We're talking about serious organisations in Russia and then Germany, even in Britain. We're not talking about the few people Trotsky happened to be left with in 1938, 39, whenever it was.
Do you want to respond, Ursula?
I don't really 100% understand your position, so it's a bit hard to respond. I had thought that you were, let me say, from what you know today, when would you have left the Social Democratic Party?
Well, 1914, presumably. What came out of it after that? Abert and Scheidman,
Okay, that wasn't clear from...
No, it was absolutely correct to split them and to split them apart.
But so where would you have been in 1919 or 1920 or the 1930s?
Well, the communists.
So you would have. So then. Okay, so I'm just curious because that's to clarify. I guess I want to pose two general questions and then open that up to the floor. So you spoke about the struggle for democracy. I guess my question would be, and this was sort of raised in an earlier panel. The greatest successes of social democracy and Marxism were not, for example, in the democratic republics of France or the United States. They were in Wilhelmine Germany and Tsarist Russia. And one of the paradoxes of the acquisition of universal suffrage, which was a great accomplishment of the 19th century, is that it didn't seem to lead necessarily to socialism, as many feared and many hoped. So the question is what is it then about universal suffrage that proved to be more conservative in some cases, in France, Bonapartism in 49, and didn't lead to socialism? And then I guess the other question is the opposite, which is that socialism in the 20th century often found itself in conflict with democratic principles, and even closer to our time, the restoration of capitalism in Eastern Europe was clearly accompanied by an extension of democracy in the sense of free elections. So there were free elections, and then people voted in governments that decollectivized property. And I guess the question is how do you see those phenomena? Anyone want to respond?
Well, I mean, I think you can. I think that you'd be dealing with a sort of spurious correlation there. What's absent from the question is the international dimension, which we keep arguing about on trains and stuff. I mean, whether or not you accept Lenin's particular theory of imperialism, Britain owned a quarter of the world in that period. And I think we do have to take into account the fact that this allows concessions to be made in the imperialist metropoles at the expense of the periphery. Russia is in a very peculiar situation, well described by Trotsky in Resulting Prospects, I believe. So there's more at work than simply extension of the suffrage. Wilhelmine Germany had a larger suffrage than Britain at the time. The parliament wasn't terribly powerful, but more people could vote. It's a common misconception. It's still the suffrage in Britain jumped from 7 million to 21 million in 1918. Anyway, that's I don't know.
Ich glaube, ich bin überfordert.
Okay.
I have trouble understanding you, Paul. I'm sorry.
Hello?
Okay, so I guess we'll take questions. Laurie?
Just because I'm really fascinated by the repetition of the last Euro conference to now, that there is a constant sense of triangulation between platypus, the IBT, and the CPGB, and I just have to explore this continuous and make it as productive as possible in this context. If I was another kind of leftist, I actually have to repeat out loud. I have some comrades in this room, and that's important. But with that in mind, I find that part of the triangulation of the engagements with platypus has both, I believe, productively both the CPGB and the IBT, is precisely this emphasis as a history and an interest and recovering and reflecting on the history of the period 1914, 1917, 1914, 1933, and that broad moment. And the disagreements that we might have over there are important. But platypus's difference, of course, is this question of the depth of the left, the depth of the left, and we understand this as an epochal condition in the present, based specifically on the failures and the inabilities of the new left to deal with this earlier period. And so my question to you is, how do you understand, how does the new left's own assessment or the politics of it in relation to the question of socialism, and the question of democracy, and the question of social democracy figure into how you understand leftist politics in the present? So the question about the new left, the 60s new left, how does that then, these issues of this time speak to the present in your politics?
All right. Yeah. So the new left is an attempt to come back to a social democracy of approximately, in Germany I would say Willy Brandt, and not, of some 20 years ago, before the so-called Godesberg program. But it's still social democracy. They haven't done anything principled against that. So if we want to give them support, for me, those parties can be approached under 2 points. One is, does it make sense to enter them, do a classical entrism, win them over or some of their people over? Or does it make sense to give them critical support in order to show to their working class base, if it is, and it's certainly less in New Labour than it was in the traditional older social democracy. Can we break them away by showing that they don't really do what they claim whenever they move a bit to the left? I have a bit of a problem. I would like to argue against Paul, but I have a problem that I don't understand him. So please bear with me. No, and it's also language. I mean, his dialect makes it very difficult for me. I'm sorry. I really don't want to.
I'm just a terrible English tourist. I come over here, I don't speak the language.
I'm sorry. I'm used to American English. I find British English difficult anyway, but your accent makes it even a bit more difficult. Sorry.
Well, are there questions from the audience or? Okay. Yeah.
Wait, but James didn't answer the question about the...
Yeah,
No.
Oh, you want to answer?
His question, because that was not a common answer to the question. Well, I don't know which question she answered.
Yeah, basically, I also felt you did not answer my question. I thought that was being avoided. But what is your own assessment of the successes and the failure of the New Left when it comes with regards to the Social Democratic Party, or the parties of social democracy?
Okay. So you didn't mean the New Left Party in the...
No, 1960s left.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think it's the third panel I'm on today, so I'm getting tired.
It's also language, yes.
Okay, so...
The 1960s New Left, how do you assess the failures and successes of social democratic parties in that period?
there were not that many social democratic projects at that period, I think. So the New Left, no, I can't answer it. I'm sorry. I think I'm out of it.
Do you want to try?
I can only speak to the British context, where the New Left has two distinct senses. There is what you could call the 1956 New Left, which comes from the split in the Communist Party in 1956 over Hungary, and the secret speech of Khrushchev and related issues, which produced did ultimately have significant impact on probably the left wing of social democracy. A lot of the people who were energised in that period, if you think of someone like Eric Hobsbawm, he later played a quite important role shoving the Labour Party to the right in the 1980s. He was Neil Kinnock's favourite Marxist, which was one kind of appellation. In 1968, that period is possibly more what you're thinking of, where in the British context, the main outcome of that was the growth of somewhat larger Trotskyist organisations than had previously existed, and concurrently the growth of Euro-communism in the official Communist Party. And the Trotskyists went on, ironically the most sort of anti-New Left Trotskyists went on to have a great deal of influence in the Labour Party in the 80s, if you think of the militant tendency, which essentially split over whether to reorient towards students in 1968, producing the International Marxist Group, which was the most new lefty of the Trot groups. In the Communist Party, the Euro-communists precisely wanted to social democratise the Communist Party. They eventually liquidated it, and they proceeded to go into the Labour Party as right-wingers, and ultimately washed up in many cases as Blairites. You think of people like Peter Mandelson and Charles Clark, and there were a couple of Trotskyists, but mostly they were Eurocommunists, or ex-Trotskyists. So it's not a great legacy if you look at it from the perspective of social democracy. On the other hand, some interesting work was done and problems were confronted. It was a politically lively time. So although the legacy on the far left seems to be very little, the groups that were produced in that period are mostly in crisis now. You think of the SWP and so on. But nonetheless, there is a body of work there and intellectual recovery which is worth holding on to, probably.
Just before you speak, I think there may be a question also of language and understanding. I think that when Laurie speaks about the New Left, I think she has in mind the idea that there was a kind of epochal change in the character of leftist politics for many people in the 60s and 70s. So when Marxism revived, there was very much a sense that, well, Marxism had to be tied to questions of race or gender. So I think that it's a broader conception of the New Left than maybe the two speakers are using. And it's not necessarily tied to particular organizations or groupings. Okay, Ted?
Richard, perhaps you could help Ursula with some main points when she doesn't understand James. To repeat
I will translate.
To overcome this language barrier, perhaps some key ones that you understand from James to transfer them somehow.
Not British English.
Yeah. Now my question. I was surprised after Corbyn's victory with the stance of the IDP and the CPGB. I would expect it to be more critical from what it is. It surprised me that they were both condemning Sanders' campaign in the US, but they were friendly to Corbyn, not friendly to the CPGB, as far as I know, actively participates. And the basis of this participation is that the Labour Party is a bourgeois workers' party. It is as if not even one day has passed since Lenin used this formulation, because since then the Labour Party and the Democrats are, especially in England after the third way politics and neoliberalism, no matter what the name is, they have become purely governing parties of Bonapartist parties, so to speak, identified with the interests of reproducing capitalism. And I want to better understand how they think that what Lenin said 1 century ago about the Labour Party, for example, is still valid no matter the history that has passed since then.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a question of quality versus quantity. I don't think that there is such a big difference between the social democracy under Corbyn than under, let's say, Brandt in Germany or other politicians before that. On the other hand, when we approach the social democracy today, or Labour today, then we would look whether entrism might make sense. Because Corbyn certainly has a huge following of workers that have illusions, in my opinion, illusions, that something might be changed. But within that program that they are defending and that they are living and that they are putting forward, there can't be a big change, otherwise he would have to make a much more serious split from his history and from the thing. If he would found something totally new body, that might make sense. On the other hand, I think that most organizations will discuss now whether they will do an entry in it. And I will be interested in how it will go out, and it is not totally clear what the IBT will do. But that doesn't mean that we will give political support for it. But as I said, entrism or critical support is also something where you actually do not say you help them. You will demask them. And that might be a good idea for Corbyn.
When Lenin was describing the Labour Party as a bourgeois workers' party, we have to keep in mind, first of all, at this point, he's certainly not talking about the rest of the Second International as was. He's talking specifically about the Labour Party. The Labour Party does not have a prehistory of having been, in some sense, a revolutionary organisation. So he's talking about it, well, it is an organisation that derives support from the working class, that cannot exist without labour unions and other working class organisations, but is an absolute kind of rock-solid support for British imperialism. And he has in mind the behaviour of the Labour Party and the British trade unions in the war, which, unlike with the Germans, was not a surprise to anyone. What else would they do? So if the Labour Party had changed, was no longer pro-imperialist, was no longer anti-working class in its actual government and practice, and was no longer, nonetheless, supported by, kept in existence by the trade unions, then Lenin's phrase would be out of date. It is all three of those things. It is as bad as it's always been. Politics in general has moved to the right, Labour has moved with it, but it has always played this role. Labour gave us the nuclear bomb. People don't get that it's always been kind of this bad. But there is still a battle to be had, precisely because it is organically connected to large organisations of the working class. And if that is our aim, if our aim is working class revolution, then we can't simply ignore this enormous strategic obstacle to getting there. We've worked out a strategy of our own to take towards the Labour Party. It's neither entrism nor simply critical support, although that's obviously, we may critically support candidates, but what used to be called fraction work. You don't have to send everyone into the party. We try and cultivate a strong sympathising periphery within the Labour Party and offer that political direction, but we keep our independent existence, and ultimately we want to overturn the bans of prescriptions and, in that sense, follow Lenin's advice, affiliate. Open up affiliations to all working class organisations, purge the right and turn it into an instrument for socialism, which it has never been. I stress again. So that's what I'm trying to get across is that this is simply the historic nature of the Labour Party, which is, the history is just different to the French socialist or the German SPD or similar organisations.
I thought the German refugee scientists, not the British Labour Party, gave us the nuclear weapons.
Oh, yes, that's fair enough. Yeah. International cooperation.
But I guess the question is then, are you looking towards a split in the Labour Party as an orientation? I mean, the argument for entrism in a Trotskyist perspective has been usually to split these organizations. So are you looking towards a split? You're saying that to make progress towards socialism, you need to split something like the Labour Party?
Yes, but we would rather be the winning side in the split.
Okay, well, and then I have a question.
Oh, yeah, no. I didn't put forward that we would want to be the losing side.
Okay, I also have a specific question. So one of the things that confuses many people, particularly in the United States, is in the United States you will frequently hear people who call themselves socialists, even Trotskyists, say that, well, they can't support Bernie Sanders because he's running as a Democrat. But they often make it clear that they could support him if he were running as an independent, right? And then the question is, well, what would be the political difference in the program? So in other words, if someone like Bernie Sanders, who is a European-style social democrat, but would represent a break to the left, would any break to the left be in some sense supportable? I mean, so I always find it a little difficult to try to understand the exact criteria. Is it purely tactical when you can critically support an independent, bourgeois workers' party candidate?
I mean, first of all, he is not a bourgeois party candidate.
Bernie Sanders is. He's a Democrat. That's a bourgeois party.
Oh, I thought a bourgeois workers' party that you.
No, but if he were running, if he broke from that and were running on the ticket of the Socialist Party, let's say, or one of those parties, would that change the character of the campaign?
Yeah, there would at least be a different. One would ask different questions of whether one could support him. That certainly is true, but I mean, you couldn't possibly remain a socialist on a Democratic Party ticket. It's a pure bourgeois party. So we would never support a candidate for a bourgeois party, because there the question, why do we support at times candidates at a bourgeois workers' party? Because when there is a certain push from the basis, they tend to move a bit to the left, but only a bit, I mean not too much. And they tend to claim that they are more left than they actually are. So you want to expose that. But what would we expose in the Democratic Party? I mean, in the Democratic Party there are Ku Klux Klan members running. I mean, I would never, we don't have to say that we would never go on a ticket with a Ku Klux Klan member in the same party. But I think that also American party politics, let me say, is so different from it. I mean, you don't even have a Labour Party or something similar. I'm not sure that is, I mean, okay, we're trying to get rid of ours, but it certainly shows something about the American political landscape, that there isn't even such a thing, and that there is not really any difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So I would say that it's just not comparable, but there's certainly nobody that we could support who would run on a Democratic Party ticket.
Have a response?
I mean, I'm less talking about Sanders as an individual, but when we're talking about individuals as presidential candidates, we have to, going back to the other themes of the panel, I don't believe in the office of president, for a start, and precisely because it focuses all this stuff on these kind of Bonapartist individuals. So yes, the organisational support for these people does matter. That's where we get to what these elections really mean in a broader social sense. We may, we can, you don't want to be absolute, no support for, individual independence, because, we may know that such and such a candidate is a good trade unionist or this or that, But our project is precisely party building. I think that's true for both of us.
Sure.
And so we are left with a political kind of landscape that we have to build on, and that's shaped by the existing forces on there, which in Britain includes the Labour Party, and in America it orbits around these two bourgeois parties of big business. So there is, there is a difference, and it's not simply about what Sanders says or what Corbyn says. For instance, it would be perfectly possible to imagine Caroline Lucas, the leader of the British Green Party, just reciting word for word every speech Jeremy Corbyn has ever made, and she wouldn't have to lie. She probably agrees with most of it, but it would be different because we're not talking about a core part of the political existence of the working class of Britain when we're talking about the Greens.
You said you don't believe in the office of president, and that raises a question. So do you draw a distinction between president and prime minister of Britain? And does that have to do with, would you oppose running candidates for executive office? Question for both of you.
You'll ask him first.
Well, I mean, look, we're getting back to the earlier...
And then we'll have... Yeah, there's a... Yeah, okay.
No, more questions.
Okay, more questions. Sorry.
It's not so much that I have a question, but there was a question in the room, which I think is a very important question, and it was not possible to answer the question from the panel, because the one person didn't either understand what is meant by New Left, and the other comrade had to say rightly that in Great Britain the New Left was not so much a topic, so that you could also not go to the question of the New Left. In respect of the leading question we had in this whole discussion. So my question would be, if I would be allowed to answer the question on what would be the special contribution of the New Left to this question. Because on the one hand, it's okay, I think it's right that we have to go back into history in order to answer questions of the present day, but it will be insufficient, I think, if we only go back to the break in history which shows both comrades where we lay on. This is the break of 1940. I would not disagree on their interpretation of 1940, but we had different breaks in between, and we cannot answer the present day questions without acknowledging a break like 1968. So let me just shortly bring to the point what is meant with the question after the New Left. New Left, we have, I think there are two phases which are very important. The one phase of New Left understand itself still as a Marxist left, which now is on their way to try to really incorporate questions like race, gender, ecology, democracy, into, and different other questions, a lot of other questions, into the framework of Marxism. That was the first, let's say, it started in the 1950s and the 1960s, led to a big of sort of groups like Socialism, Barbary, Situationist International, the whole operation in Italy, critical theory in Germany, and all these. This is the kind of first phase, which means we have a lot of new questions, and we have to open up Marxism to make it able to answer these new questions. And then there was a second phase, and there could be a relay back to Althusser. The very late Althusser said in a certain point, he said, something has broken. And what he meant by this sentence, something has broken, was it is not possible to integrate these kind of new questions, which we cannot avoid, into the Marxist framework. That means the second phase of New Left, we have to leave the Marxist framework behind us.
Okay.
That leads, and now we come to the problematic point.
Okay.
Yeah. That leads to the point that a very famous expression by Foucault, which I would integrate in the second phase of New Left, is very similar to a phrase of Thatcher. Foucault at a certain point that we have to destroy everything that could be named as society. That was a radical phrase of New Left, very similar to the phrase of Thatcher. There is no such thing, that society.
Okay.
And the problem with that is that I really think that the problem of New Left, and that is the way we have to confront this, the weakness of New Left, that at least while being able to answer all the new questions, they were not able to answer the very old question, how to smash capitalism. So, and I think if we want to find, now stop with history, if we want to find an answer to the questions of this panel now, we have, the problem is to answer the question how to smash capitalism, but integrating all the other questions and all the other point of view which we had to learn from 1968. Like there is no central subject. All she said, comrade from the International Bolshevist Tendency, yeah? I know this by heart. You can even wake me up in the night and I could repeat it, blah, 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 blah. There is a revolutionary class. The revolutionary class has an objective interest. Unfortunately, it didn't know about this objective interest. It's the task of the communists to go to the class and tell them about the objective interest. As soon as they understand the objective interest, they will smash capitalism, and by this way the proletarian class will liberate all men, blah, blah, blah. That will not lead to anything any longer. Yeah? On the other hand, if you go back to Foucault to destroy everything that could be made as society, there is also a problem. So I think, and now I'm coming back a little bit to the panel discussion we had before. We had, concerning the question of your panel, socialism, social democracy, we have a kind of combination at the moment of struggles, movement, and parties of a new type, of question of how to transcend the nation state, whereas don't ignore the nation state, participation in elections, but know about the limited power of elections, things like that. Yeah. So this, I think, is the set of questions we have to answer.
Can we let the panelists... also, Cengiz, did you have a question? And we'll get...
Well, the word success is very relative when you look at the development of parties. But let's take after World War II, why was basically social democracy very successful in integrating huge parts of society, and Marxism wasn't. I mean, they were in countries like Austria, they were even able to integrate interest Trotskys and Nazis. They built, I mean, I would even argue that the membership of social democracy between the 40s and 60s was higher than ever in history, and even the question here comes up. What we have that Richard always reminds in panels is like why Trotsky's speculation that in this after the World War II there will be a revolution.
Okay, how about our responses, particularly to the...
I'm wondering how you measure success. But
also, to respond to the first point about the new social movements and whether everything has been changed since 1968.
Okay, I don't think that it has qualitatively changed. Not very much. That there are a whole bunch of groups that have gone and have come and they have gone is a clear thing. In Germany it were basically the Maoists. There were large groups that came and went away, but it is done as if there is some really qualitative change, and I don't think that it was that. There wasn't all that big an interest for a long time. There was a short flame that came up, there were some sparks, but that was about it. So qualitatively, I don't see the success you especially have talked about.
Wasn't the Spartacist League founded in the early 60s and it's part of this project? And the Spartacist League is part of the origins of the IDP?
That is right, yes. But it was always a very small organization in comparison. So is that the big success we are talking about?
No, I'm talking about trying to recognize the failures and how they form the present.
Oh, there were all kind of failures. Certainly, of a whole bunch of the groups. All of the left was not able to really get much out of the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement. Neither here in Germany nor in the US, really. Not many of the groups, and in most other countries it was the same thing. I'm wondering whether you see it as a success that small groups or even a bit larger groups like the Maoists here existed for a certain amount of time. I wouldn't call it that as a success. I think that nothing has changed in that sense, and that is what you don't think. But see, for me it is still the only success there was the Russian Revolution. And all those attempts, one says, in the 68 there was an organization that grew a bit bigger. So we have to learn out of that. Big learn out of that. I can't see that, and I don't see that. Because I think that the only model that has ever had any success, the success I want, was the Russian Revolution. And that's the model that I would like to, do again. So yes, I'm Russian Orthodox in that sense. I'm sure you would.
I think there may be an issue as I seem to be quite frequently misunderstood this evening. I actually was, in a sense, talking about the things you're discussing. When I talk about the Euro-communist faction, these are the people who latched onto, within the Communist Party, who latched onto women's lib, gay lib, race questions, that sort of thing. As it happened, they were a very right-wing form of that, and their ultimate impact was, you could say, crudely, was Blairism. On the other hand, the people like the International Marxist Group presented at that time a very sort of what we would think of as 68er, hyper-revolutionary. They were Trotskyists, but they started calling themselves left communist on the cover of their paper. They did interviews with John Lennon and all this sort of thing. So that combination of ultra-leftism and countercultural cheese lived among them. But my point is that they ultimately were...
What do you think of the characterization of the Russian Revolution as the model, the Bolshevik Revolution as the model to follow?
Well, in a sense, it's kind of like it is a historic event, but in the peculiar way of left-wingers, where we have to go back in time and decide what side we're on in such and such a date. It is a good thing that it happened. It was a supportable event, and if one had been in Russia, in Petrograd in 1917, blah, 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 blah. The Russians didn't think it was a model for Europe. The idea that you're going to model your revolutionary movement on the upheavals in a country on the fringes of Europe with an incredibly backward economy would have been nonsensical everywhere. It is merely the fact that the revolution failed to spread left Moscow and Petrograd as the centre, whether it liked it or not, of the international communist movement, and its increasing prestige left it as this kind of idea that, well, now one has to copy the Russians. And even that didn't really take hold until the end of the 20s. So it's, yes, people took inspiration from it, but they weren't, silly on that level. It wasn't a model, it was a success for our collective movement. There is a difference there.
Show me other successes.
Well, precisely. That's the problem.
Speak about other successes.
Well,
Why do I emphasize it so? Because is there any other success that you guys could bring as an example? Anybody?
Well, I mean, I would consider it the one breakthrough of a wide movement of building mass revolutionary workers' parties throughout Europe, including the SPD and the Parti Ouvrier and others, and the Italians. They didn't successfully make revolutions. Most of them politically collapsed in 1914. But there is no Bolshevik party without the SPD having millions and millions of members. That put a lot of people who previously supported populism, narodism, on the part of thinking, well, I want some of that. So to me, the two things are sort of indissociable. It would have, obviously, in order for this to be a lasting success, and we have to remember the society collapsed. It's a success in a certain limited sense, but we're living in the shadow of its collapse. So we have to untangle that a bit. You know, why did it succeed? I suppose is actually what you were trying to bring out earlier, Richard, as possibly a more serious difference between the two of us. I'm sorry, Thomas, we've ended up via circuitous route going back to arguing about where one is in 1917.
Well, let me ask you to follow up his question. Do you see any fundamental transformations of the world that require transformation of left thought since 1968, or is it just ephemeral shower?
I see the story is essentially that we have had a complete collapse of the left, the left that considers itself partisans of the working class, and that includes the new left, and that is what's in that sense qualitatively changed about the situation in which we operate. It's much easier to do our jobs if there's a Stalinist Communist Party and a Labour Party with a substantial left, however horrible these things are, but we don't have those anymore.
I see questions from Soros and Stefan and the person who speaks. Oh, okay, so afterwards, Soros and Stefan and the person over there.
My question is, you said in your beginning remark that the name of Social Democratic was said that it was a poor wordplay or a poor word. And I want to ask why. Can you explain it a little bit further? Why it was remarked by Marx that it was a pure description, but it had to do it?
Should we take questions? Or?
Yeah, take the one from Stefan and other people. Yeah.
We were talking about social democracy, mainly in its importance for Marxism. But then in the beginning we heard that Marx himself was picking up on a movement which was forming itself and was choosing forms for itself in which he, even though he didn't consider himself as the first Marxist, intervened with his friend Frederick Engels. And also Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and Lenin made an intervention into the actually existing organizations that working class had built up. And now we're talking about a working class party or a social democratic party as if it could be built from scratch. And not that it was this entity which arose out of the history of the 19th century and also of the decline of the left in the year of 1848. And my question is, are we maybe formulating the question in the wrong direction if we are asking for a new working class party to be built just to capture them by Marxism, or if the question is if Marxism itself played a big role in blocking the way for a new working class party to come into existence over the course of the 20th century. So my question is, what do we expect to happen with social democratic parties? Do we expect them to disappear, new ones to form, new ones to take over? Or what's the expectation for new Marxist approach in working class politics?
So to sum up your question, it's a question about how do you see the future of social democracy in the present?
Yeah, but also how we regard its own history, because it seems like something which was ready-made as a point of advantage for Marxism, but it wasn't only that, but it was a self-organization of the class in a social struggle, which was itself transformed by the actual politics of Marxism, which is informing our history right now. The SPD under Schröder would have never existed without the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the decline of the social project of the Bolshevik Party. So I guess we can't talk from the decline of social democracy without its history of being something which Marxism intervened into.
Okay, so there's one... Oh, okay.
Should we take more?
Well, do Genghis and Lucy, and then... you had a question. He had a question. He had a question too.
I just wanted to repeat my question because it wasn't answered. And just to change the terminology, why was social democracy in the 40s to the 60s able to integrate huge parts of society into the party, and Marxism wasn't? Why is just the answer to it, as I hear it here, that it might have been a failure of demasking social democracy. This is basically saying people are stupid. This is that people are not able to understand, are kind of fooled. This is a shortcoming what you hear also when you hear explanations of fascism, that working class people and pretty bourgeois people were just fooled by Nazis and fascists. They were not just one movement.
Here and Lucy, and then we'll.
Are you sure that we should take 5 questions?
Okay, so we'll.
Then we go.
Yeah, you can answer those, and then we'll get you on the next round.
Okay. In the 40s, it was pretty clear. After 45, it was pretty clear that there weren't any other parties that the working class could collect behind. The communists were rather later in organizing it. The first party that came out with a paper, the first party that came out as an organization, heavily supported in North Germany, where I come from, heavily supported by the Labour Party that was in power, that I found from my father all kind of documents that they were that they didn't need to take the curfew, and as the only explanation was SPD. So there were heavy support of the British occupation, in the British occupation zone, for the Social Democratic Party. All of the other parties needed much longer to organize. So the SPD was quite a way ahead of the rest of them. And let's say the communists needed quite a while, and I think even more of them were actually killed. And I can only speak basically from the German experience. Somebody said that Schröder, Stefan did, Schröder wouldn't have come to power in Germany if it hadn't been for the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think Schröder wouldn't have gotten away with what he did in Germany. The cuts were actually harder than the Christian Democrats would have ever dared to do. And some of those were actually the ones that the SPD voted against when they were in opposition, were exact same things that Schröder came up with. And I think he got away with it because the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was ripe for the social democracy to come back to power. Whether it would have been Schröder or somebody else, I think it wouldn't have made a big difference. Schröder could just sell it a bit better. It was the time that they were consciously taking a position of cuts. I mean, that is, if you want, some of the biggest losses in Germany for the working class were administered by the Social Democrats. It weren't the right-wingers who did those. The right-wingers tried to put them forward, and there would have been strikes. But against the social democracy, the trade union movement is basically quiet. There have been little demonstrations, but nothing big. So that is the big danger on the social democracy, that the trade union movement is still very much behind the social democracy, and if whatever the social democracy does, the fight from the trade unions is much less heavy. On the other hand, if you think about any other parties that are being created, the split from the German social democracy toward the left party is basically a bourgeois workers' party from the outset.
Is it a workers' party?
Yes. It's the trade union leaders, some of them. It's huge amounts of the leading members of the social democracy. It's those that several of the left organizations have said they are the best hope of the working class. And the workers who don't follow the social democrats follow those. So that's pretty clear, yes. They have a basis, and they are founded by members of the working class, certainly. And more, even in the unions, you will find that people are following the left party. I mean, you can also see it from the votes. Where are they supposed to come from, right? A huge amount of votes that are going to happen. I think that's enough for now. I'm sure I haven't answered everything.
Quickly in response, why was it a bad name? Because it wasn't communist. It wasn't the name they would have chosen if then chosen name hadn't been banned. So that was whatever, 4th, 5th on the list, but it stuck. And then ironically by 1912, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, its factions had to run, the Bolsheviks ran as consistent Democrats because social democracy was a banned but voted word in Russia. So tells you something about how words change, I suppose. Social Democrat success in the 40s, the 60s, I'm assuming this is in reference to the sort of welfare era, the thing that people call Fordism, for somewhat anachronistically. I think there are two sides to it. Firstly, we have to understand this is Cold War policy. This is a response to Soviet tanks on the Elbe. It's part of the... it comes in that sense with the Marshall Plan. The US was willing to impose on Europe sort of mixed economies and so forth that it would never adopt itself. This is the era of the transfer of global dominance, with the exception of the Soviet bloc, from Britain to America, and it's an aspect of that. The other side to it is, well, was it in that sense inevitable, and therefore was any attempt to undermine it pointless? My view is that it would probably probably be quite unlikely, given the most glorious revolutionary leadership in the world, for serious forward progress to be made under those conditions in the countries of Western Europe. However, we may have built something in the less propitious times that could have made something of the then much more bitter industrial struggles and explosion of different social movements that came together in the 70s under the pressure of the breakdown of the post-war consensus and the global switch from containment of communism to rolling it back. I hope that sort of gets into a bit. I mean, precisely, we had a workers' movement dominated by Stalinism and dominated secondarily by forces unable successfully to challenge Stalinism from the left, so things ended up as they did. Building from scratch, I mean, in Russia they pretty much were building from scratch. You know, we're not talking about a huge mass workers' movement. The origins of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks are in tiny circles of people getting together to spread literature and existing for about a couple of months and then getting smashed and arrested. You know, this is about as close to building from scratch as you ever can be, given that we have cause and effect back to the birth of the universe. Even in Germany, okay, it wasn't like Ferdinand Lassalle woke up one day and was like, well, hey, I have thousands of workers. This was something that had to be consciously built. And then, the impact of Marxism on that movement, again, as you say, it was an intervention, but precisely when it became a successful intervention, people did try in that sense to replicate it from scratch. I started off with the American Civil War as well. You see things in cities in America of them trying to build these things, which in the end never came to anything. But yes, I think we're talking in a period where things aren't great. It says something that, there's a lot of excitement around Jeremy Corbyn, whose politics would have been considered wildly right-wing in, 1965 within Labour Party politics, but that's where we are. But we do, I still don't see in that sense any better hope. I see a lot of talk about social movements, but they come and they go. And then people 10 years later say, oh, wasn't that good? Well, no, it's not still here. So I don't think there's been a better alternative to trying to build a party as an organisation that can persist through time.
We had two questions here.
Ursula said that 1917 was the only success, and more or less I would agree. But regarding this, I would like to ask two questions, which both go in different directions. The one question is, when we take this seriously, that there was only one success, what does it mean regarding the claim of Trotskys being the authentic interpretation of Leninism? Because none of the Trotskist organizations came close to anything what was similar to 1917. So, should we consider that the split of the communist movement after the death of Lenin is to interpret more complicated than that there is a one tradition which has a correct understanding of Leninism, and all other tendencies who claim well to be Leninists have not really read or not really understood Lenin. And the second question is, even when we take all the other Leninist tendencies, maybe we can add China and Yugoslavia to the list of the successes. But however, since China and Yugoslavia it was decades ago. So I will again refer to the question regarding the new left. Is there something like a common mistake of all this? Old left claiming to be Leninist organizations, but the causes failure. Or I guess is it a bit simple to say, or the other, each of these organizations says this and this was a mistake of our competitors. But I guess it's too easy to say they have not really understood what is to do, because we have such different versions of this concept, and none of these conceptions or versions were successful. On the other hand, you can say the same regarding the new left. There was also no success, but so I think we have to consider that we need something different.
Lucy.
Thank you. I think I just perhaps wanted to come back to some of the deeper sort of historical questions, which possibly people have agreement with, or you guys have agreement with on the panel, but maybe differences of opinion will come out. Just on universal suffrage and 1848. As I understand it, like that there was a kind of lesson learned by Marx and Engels that about the character of universal suffrage, that under the new kind of capitalist state form, that meant that democracy on its own in capitalism produced something kind of contradictory, in that the working class voted, and along with other groups in society, but there was a kind of a problem about how to vote, whether the working class was able to vote in its own interests. And I suppose I just wanted to hear more from you both about how you understand 1848, and maybe the problem of Bonapartism, and its kind of continuing kind of legacy today. It had this Trotsky used the term again in terms of trying to characterize Stalinism, and potentially, we've had sort of casual references to kind of Bonapartist individuals that might be voted in to power in the present, but I'm not quite sure what you mean there, James. So I just want to know from you both maybe what you think about the legacy of Bonapartism and the capitalist state form as playing into this problem of democracy and socialism.
Should we maybe take a couple more questions and then have the closing remarks, or do you think we should?
Well, how many more questions are there? Okay. Okay, so take the other questions.
Or, I mean,
we can take the questions.
Not so much a question as a thesis, completely different area of a different topic actually, but still on topic, I hope. Just want to put forward a thesis that within the near future, social democratic parties will either disappear or change beyond recognition, so there's not much point in actually even talking about them anymore. And so in order to phrase that question, what do you think about that?
One is that, left is that. All things this evening were discussed, I can later, but are very known. The left has big problems to understand the actual situation. We have very traditional onsets and a lot of history, and I think we have a lot of open questions. There is another contribution that was from him, and partly I have accordance to him. It is necessary to go back to the analysis Marx made and to find out how this has to be continued, and the new situations which now have occurred and now reign the situation in society are to be analyzed. Marx for himself a long time not had to be understand. For a lot of his books, part of his books were not known. And for Marx it is important that he had a special method and that he taught history and society as being in development, and especially the commodity producing society in terms of alienation and verdienung and fetish character. This means a special alienated situation which produces a corresponding kind of thinking in society which performs practice. And in this reverse reciprocal representations, Marx tried to analyze society, and now it is getting to be a more analyzed society because, my question is, how do you think you would be able to analyze and to the situation today and to find an adequate kind of politics?
Okay.
Oh, let him first.
I get that one.
Well, you get all of them.
I get all of them. Right. So, in order, why do we only have? There is this one success. Why is there only one success? Isn't there a problem if there's only one success? Yes, we have all failed. I come from a political tradition that in 1991 had the rug pulled out from under it. We had been based on the idea of defending the Soviet Union and this sort of thing, and it was gone. And we were in the British Communist Party, and it was wound up. And precisely those all. I think when people talk about, things are so much different now, they have often in mind the economic transformations in the Western capitalist countries of the late 70s and then 80s and then 90s in terms of the breakdown of the welfare consensus. I don't think that's a significant change. The significant change is that the Soviet Union came into being as a worker state in 1917, ceased to be any kind of working class in worker state in 1928. It became a bizarre entity on the world stage and then collapsed in 1991. If you want the story of the 20th century, that's kind of it.
And Lucy's question.
Yes, the next one, I've got the list. Bonapartism. This is also your question. I guess that's why you're a special interest, because you started asking me it and then you lost interest and picked someone else. The Bonapartism issue. I mean, the thing with talking about 1848 is difficult because we're talking about several different issues here. Primarily, the generalised failure of the uprisings, but then in particular the rise of the nephew, Louis Bonaparte, in France, and these are, in a sense, two separate issues. In terms of their significance for sort of Marxist thinking, I mean, the failure of the 1848 revolutions, is traditionally understood on the Marxist left as being, well, this is the moment when Marx no longer had any illusions in the bourgeoisie. I think you can actually date that back to about 1842, but fine. The point is the bourgeoisie played an abominable role, allied with the old elites, and people had to flee. Massive repression. The question of Bonapartism, it's I don't in that sense know what to say, except that it is a form of government based around the idea of a strong, charismatic leader who communicates directly with the masses in the broad sense. And it is a style of politics that kind of comes and goes and is more present in some places than in others. Louis Bonaparte's regime is the prototype, but you could also talk, even if we just look at the left, of, say, Hugo Chavez seems to me to be a pretty clear example of the kind, and projects of that nature. And there is that danger inherent in the highly... Basically, the US is a sort of presidential monarchy. You know, the executive power is quite intense there. Even more so with France, and in Britain, it is a monarchy. You know, the Prime Minister isn't simply the leader of the fraction of the largest party. The Prime Minister tells the Queen what to say. You know, the Prime Minister wields the executive power of the Crown. And precisely the going back to the original topic, this classic Republican democratic approach, and it's older than Marx and Engels. This is the Chartist. It's the supremacy of a single unicameral legislature, which as opposed to the kind of separation of powers things and presidential regimes, or Supreme Court getting to decide what laws we can make and things like that. Social democratic parties have changed beyond recognition. I feel like I've already addressed this. They haven't. The Labour Party today is absolutely recognisable from the Labour Party of 1918 if you look at its core characteristics of what role it plays in society. Yes, it's more right-wing. Society is more right-wing. It needs to keep up. It's very fashionable.
So what about the prediction that social democratic parties are about to disappear?
I think I don't buy that. Historic parties do not just wink out of existence. I don't buy. We heard a lot about how the Labour Party was being pacified from the likes of Richard Seymour. It was going to disappear and be destroyed by the SNP, Scottish Nationalists, and the Greens, and so on. Well, the shoe is now officially on the other foot. That's only in Britain, but I don't see that this is going to...
There would also be the replacement by another one.
Oh, yes.
Bourgeois Workers' Party.
Oh, yes, of course. I can't remember what his silly scheme was, but he was still defending it about 3 weeks ago. I don't know what's happened to that guy. But in any case, I just don't buy it. I think recent developments have reconfirmed that these parties are not going anywhere soon. They would have been more destroyed than they are now. I don't know what else to say. I failed to note down the comrade's question over here. So
I think it was sort of what one would do facing the future. Like what, I think it was a question of if anything new needed to be done.
There are always new things that need to be done.
But fundamentally, that's fundamentally
because
I think part of the question here, which is part of the difference that was raised before, is do we understand that the old categories are still basically valid, or do we need to think in terms of some new categories?
I like to there's a bit of a depressive tone in here, and I don't particularly like that. Although I start out with saying that if we don't make a revolution sooner or later, we can just about forget it. Because this, it won't get any better. So we let a better work on it. So how do we do it? None of the Trotskyist organizations are close to 1917, Georgia said. All the other Leninist tendencies have made common mistakes, etc. I think that we actually all have walked in that direction. But we have had our own experiences of deformed organizations, of the regime questions, there weren't Stalins that came, but there was certainly a whole bunch of bureaucratization of the organizations. There were all kind of different things, and that doesn't just concern the Trotskyist organizations. There certainly has been at least that amount in the Maoist organizations. There has been at least that amount in the softer left organizations. So what we have to do is not only build an organization, but also guard against anything that might have the seeds of Stalinism or of bureaucratic distortion in any way. And I think that is much more difficult than the rest of it, because most of the organizations that were built certainly have that, had that. That's why we split when we were another new organization. The CPGB has their experiences with it. We certainly have. With some of the organizations we split from, or where our people came from, or etc. So that's a big problem. People who go in left organizations at times tend to want to be leaders, and if you have too many of those, you are left with all the chiefs and with hardly any Indians. Social democracy might disappear. I think that at this stage, generally I have nothing against it. It would be good if it was replaced by something that could make a revolution, but that is not likely to happen in the very near future, I think. And I think that if it is replaced in some countries, then it would be replaced by something that is on the same level, namely a Bourgeois Workers' Party. I think 1848, I could agree with you on it, so I join on that. I think that's about it.
I'm not sure exactly how much time is left.
I think 10 minutes.
So we could have closing statements then? Or any more questions? We could take some.
One more question on Bonapartism.
Yeah. Or 2 questions then. 3 questions? Okay, well, is it okay if we just do questions? And so we'll do the 3 questions.
Okay, picking up again on Lucy's question of Bonapartism. I guess the question was also pointed in the direction that Marx is trying to emphasize that the bourgeoisie is not able to push society any further. And also through Bonapartism there comes the state that there's an obstacle for workers to take over, because bourgeoisie installs like an authoritarian state, which is keeping the workers off from entering directly into the center of power. And so my question maybe would be, in how far becomes Bonapartism relevant again in the sense that the former workers' parties are part of this system, and that the workers' control in any kinds of way has vanished, but still these parties are there and occupying this position of being the official parties of the workers, and maybe this keeping people from identifying themselves as workers.
Okay.
There was a question posed over there before about like Trotskyism. Maybe it's an indication of Trotskyism being the wrong interpretation of Lenin because it just didn't like really accomplish that much. I think, yeah, maybe that's a problem, but not just for Trotskyism, but for Leninism in general. That the thing Lenin was good about is like posing or making a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, driving strategy from there, which means making on historical, political, and economic level an analysis of contemporary capitalism. And what I heard from this podium was that in the 20th century pretty much nothing changed on the left side, or on the right side the only thing that changed is that real existing socialism collapsed, which is quite hilarious actually, because I think a lot of things changed. There's complete ethnicization and differentiation within the working class on a national and a global scale, and I think from there we should like maybe write new strategies, and maybe we should talk about that.
Didn't you have a question? Did you have an?
No matter. I go without microphone. I will ask a question on the concept of change. Is here in the room. Narrowing change on 1917, that was the idea of success and change, and nothing. I think that it's nearly non-political to say something like that. If we are going back to this, like 1848, we could start with 1789, installment at least of freedom of thought, rather as a kind of sentence where all politics is subject to. Then we could say that from this moment on, and that is, I suppose, that is change. Bourgeois society has been made much more inclusive as it was ever thought before. That is the result of the history of the workers' movement, and not only 1917, that includes that includes 50, 60, 80 years of social democracy, like the question that was raised in the beginning, that from the 1950s on to the 1970s, that is the hugest amount of membership of social democracy. Why? Whether people were fooled or in following up changes, and then coming back to 1968, if there was no change, I think the way we are sitting here, the way we are sitting, the way we are talking, the way we are leading our everyday life, would be not even possible without 1968. And you can ask thousands and thousands of people out there if their life meaningfully, dramatically, substantially has changed during the last 30, 40 centuries. So I think there's a lot of change which does not fit into the concept 1970 is the only change. The problem is that all those changes have been absorbed by capitalism. But we cannot deny that changes have been fought through, have been achieved by struggles, and if we want to bring up change any further, we have to have another concept of change. If you only go back to 1970, we will achieve nothing.
Okay, so we have three questions about Bonapartism again, about the failure of Trotskyism or Leninism, and about the concept of change, which is the biggest and most fundamental. Do you want to answer first? Or?
Okay. When no one's saying that nothing has changed, but the significance of the changes depends on the scale on which you're measuring the changes. If we're talking about the past 50 years, yes, there have been enormous advances in terms of women's rights. We were talking about it earlier. It's a positive example. We have much wider availability of abortion and control over bodies than we did on average in the 60s, early 60s. Fine. If we're talking about sort of stratification of the working class and so forth, I'm sorry, these things are not even remotely new. And I'm not talking about like 100 years ago in 1917, I'm talking 200 years ago. The working class has always been stratified. It's always been on the edge of precarity. These things are imagined to be new because, for the sole reason that the period of the 1940s and 1960s of the high point of high watermark of social democracy in its sort of in the post-war consensus is an absolute historical aberration in the history of capitalism. So the question is not how are things different now to in the 60s and 70s with the guiding assumption that things were continuous up to then. It's sort of, how the hell did we have this weird little several decade stretch where capitalism almost half abolished itself to save itself? It's very, very strange historical situation. I'm not going to give you the analysis of it because, contrary to the picture I may have given you earlier, no, very interesting books still need to be written about this. We still need to argue. There is an enormous amount of stuff that Marx didn't cover, that all the great classes put together didn't cover, and they're all genuinely new things. We do have to deal with, for instance, the accelerating pace of technology or something like that, which is taking very different forms to the old machines in the 19th century. Fine. Bonapartist, I accept Bonapartism's description of the internal character of the social democratic party. What I would say is that there's been certainly in Britain, there's been a very noticeable change in the last 25 to 30 years in the Labour Party, in that it's hollowed out. So we end up with, I would say, generals without armies rather than chiefs and Indians, because I'm a terrible liberal. But what it comes down to is that, yes, and now what we have is this sort of apparatus for turning careerist students into MPs, but kind of almost nothing. The Scottish National Party was, for a brief moment, more than half the size of the Labour Party, despite organising by definition about 5% of the British population. And that tells you something. It tells you that the SNP's got people excited and actually includes people in their work, whatever their many, many faults. And the Labour Party had come to absolutely fear them. So the whole apparatus was blown over very quickly in the summer, which is the sort of final evidence of it. So it's sort of Bonapartism without the massive mountebanks and peasants and whatever else were propping it up. It's an odd thing. I think I've tried. I mean, the Leninism and Trotskyism stuff is. Well, I don't think any extant variant of 20th century inheritors of Leninism did manage to make another success. So on that level, I agree with you. But we have to, nonetheless, sorry about this, I know I said I wasn't going to answer it, I know I am. But nonetheless, I don't think that we can just reject all that.
I think we're a bit short of time.
Yeah, sorry.
At the end I didn't understand, but
he said none of them accomplished anything.
Okay.
So he agrees with you.
All right.
But I think, yes, the question of change.
I would first like to... Somebody said Leninism maybe should be replaced. I wouldn't know with what. And maybe somebody comes up with a real good idea, then we can talk about it. But up to now I haven't heard one. There's a lot of criticism on the old forms, but none has put forward any valid replacement for those theories that I have read, and there might be some anarchists who might think that they have the solution, it hasn't convinced me yet. So for me, Leninism is still the program that I follow as long as somebody hasn't come up with something better to do. And we have the goal, and nobody else has up to now done what needs to be done. That's the only model that I know of. I'm sure we can talk about the many attempts where anarchists had the chance to make a revolution. I remember Spain or some such thing, and where they always consciously avoided to do so. Or maybe unconsciously. I think nothing more has to be said about Bonapartism. I think I leave it at that.
So should we just end it now, I think? Okay. Thank you everyone for coming.